Hello, friends of Hush and Sleep. Welcome. Find a place where you can rest, where the weight of the day can begin to melt from your shoulders. Allow your body to grow heavy, comfortably heavy, sinking into the surface that supports you. Take a slow, deep breath in, feeling the air fill your lungs. And as you exhale, release the noise, release the hurry, release the world outside this moment. Another breath just for you. In and out. Let the gentle rhythm of your own breathing become your anchor, a quiet drumbeat in the stillness of the room. If you feel so inclined, a simple tap on the like button or a quiet subscription is a wonderful way to support our shared journey. It is a silent whisper that tells us you are here, resting with us. Now, let your mind drift. We are about to step into a place where timelines have blurred, where the clang of steel and the silent hum of the future exist together. We are going to witness a world that is both familiar and utterly strange. A world where medieval wars watched from the silent heavens. Let the story begin. The chamber was a hollow in the heart of the mountain, a place far removed from the sunlit battlements and bustling courtyards of the citadel. Here, the air was always cool, still, and carried the scent of deep earth and ozone, a strange, sharp perfume that clung to the tapestries and the stone. King Theron, his hair the color of winter frost, and his face a map of long years, did not sit upon his gilded throne. His throne was here, a simple, high-backed chair of dark, unadorned oak, facing the chamber's sole occupant, the obsidian scryer. It was a pool, a perfect circle of polished black stone nearly 10 feet across, set into the floor. Its surface was so impossibly smooth, so profoundly dark. It did not reflect the few glowing crystals set in sconces on the wall. It seemed instead to swallow the light, to hold a private, starless night within its depths. Theron watched, his hands resting on the cool wood of his chair's arms. Beside him stood Alara, the scryer's keeper, her robes the color of twilight, her presence as silent as a falling shadow. She alone knew the incantations, the quiet gestures that coaxed the scryer to wake. "Show me the wold," the king's voice was low, a gravelly whisper that barely disturbed the profound silence. Alara nodded, her movements fluid and deliberate. She did not speak, but rather hummed a single low-frequency note. It was a sound you felt more than heard, a vibration that resonated in the bones and made the air feel thick. The surface of the scryer shimmered. For a moment, it was like looking into water disturbed by a thrown pebble. Ripples of faint, silvery light spread from the center, distorting the perfect blackness. Then the ripples subsided, and an image began to form. The trees were like the bristles of a great dark brush. A river snaked through it, a ribbon of mercury under a sky the scryer did not show. But Theron knew it was day in the wold. The unblinking eyes, the celestial shards his ancestors had only dreamed of as wandering stars, saw all, day or night. They were the kingdom's greatest secret, not magic as the common folk would believe, but a legacy of a forgotten age, an inheritance of impossible knowledge. Ilara's hum changed pitch almost imperceptibly. Her fingers traced a pattern in the air just above the stone's surface. The image on the scryer zoomed, descending smoothly, silently, without a sound. The forest canopy rushed up, and then they were through it, gazing down upon a clearing. Borin the bull's army. They were ants, thousands of them, tiny figures milling around campfires that bloomed like dull orange flowers. Theron could see the muddy tracks carved by wagon wheels, the sprawling, disorderly lines of tents, the picket lines where horses stood, heads bowed in the cold. There was no sound, not the crackle of the fires, not the rough laughter of the soldiers, not the whinny of the horses, only the silent, all-seeing gaze. It was the cleanest war ever fought. From this chamber there was no blood, no stench of fear and sweat, no screams of the dying. There was only data, information, the sterile, geometric movement of a threat. "The vanguard is camped 3 leagues closer than the scouts reported," Theron murmured, his old warrior's mind instantly calculating. "They are moving faster than we thought. They march with little rest. Alara's voice was a soft echo in the room. Their supply train is stretched thin. They forage as they go. The image shifted again at her unspoken command, drifting over the camp. It focused on a group of men dragging fallen logs, another group butchering a deer. The details were faint, ghostly, but clear enough. The unblinking eyes saw heat, movement, and shape. They painted a picture for the scryer to display. Theron felt a familiar cold knot in his stomach. It was the feeling before a battle, but this was different. In his youth, he would have been on horseback, smelling the snow in the air, feeling the grit of the road, seeing the faces of his men. Now he was a god, perched on a cloud of black stone, watching his enemies with a detachment that chilled him to the bone. "And the phantoms?" he asked. "Are they ready?" "They are," Alara confirmed. He gave a slight nod. "Send one. I want Bourne to know we are watching." This was the other half of the inheritance. If the unblinking eyes were their gods, the whispering phantoms were their angels. Or their demons, depending on who was looking. Alara moved to a smaller pedestal near the wall. Upon it rested a single, intricately carved wooden box. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a collection of polished stones, each etched with a single, complex rune. She selected one, her fingers closing around it. Far away, on the highest spire of the citadel, a silent mechanism responded. A section of the stone crenellations retracted, revealing a dark opening. From within, something stirred. It was shaped like a dragonfly, but wrought of a dark, non-reflective metal and spun glass. It had no pilot, no soul. It was 4 feet long with slender wings that began to beat the air, not with the flutter of an insect, but with a barely audible, high-frequency hum. The whispering phantom lifted from its perch. It did not roar or shriek. It simply rose, a dark sliver against the gray sky, and then it was gone, accelerating with a speed that no bird could match. Back in the chamber, Alara placed the runestone she held onto a specific point on the scryer's edge. The main image of the army camp remained, but in a corner of the dark pool, a new, smaller window opened. It was the phantom's view. The world seen through its glass eye was different, sharper, colder. It saw the landscape as a series of lines and thermal signatures. The river was a dark, cold slash. The forest was a textured blanket of muted greens and browns. It flew low, hugging the contours of the land, a ghost in the machine of the world. Theron watched the small window, his knuckles white on the arms of his chair. He saw his own kingdom rush by beneath the phantom. The farms, the woods, the rolling hills, all silent, all reduced to a map. The phantom crossed the invisible line that marked the edge of his domain and entered the hostile territory of the wold. It slowed, its hum dropping in pitch. The image in the corner window showed it ascending, rising above the tree line. And there it was, Bourne's army. But now it was no longer a silent picture from above. The phantom's senses were more acute. It began to transmit sound. Faintly at first, then growing clearer, the sounds of the camp filtered into the stone chamber. The distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the chop of an axe, the murmur of 1,000 voices blended into a low, continuous roar. On the surface of the scryer, Theron could see the tiny figures in the main image suddenly stop what they were doing. They looked up, one pointed, then another. A ripple of confusion spread through the camp. The phantom was now hovering directly over them, a dark cross hanging in the sky. To the soldiers on the ground, it was an apparition. It made a sound unlike any bird or insect, a high, unnerving thrum that seemed to drill into the skull. It did not move with the wind, it simply hung there, a thing of impossible geometry, its single glass eye staring down. Panic began to set in. A man fell to his knees, crossing himself. Another threw a stone, which fell pathetically short. A horse, spooked by the sound or the collective fear of the men, reared and broke free, galloping wildly through the camp, adding to the chaos. Bourne the bull himself emerged from his great tent, a giant of a man clad in furs and iron. He squinted at the sky, his hands shielding his eyes. Theron could see the confusion warring with anger on his face, even in the ghostly image of the scryer. He shouted an order. A group of archers assembled, knocking arrows to their strings. "Let them," Theron whispered. The archers fired. A volley of arrows flew upwards. The phantom's eyes saw them coming, rising like a swarm of angry gnats. They reached the apex of their flight and fell, harmlessly. The phantom was too high, its metallic skin too resilient. It did not attack. It did not drop fire or stone. It simply watched. This was its purpose. Not to kill, but to terrify, to unnerve, to plant a seed of doubt and superstition in the heart of an army that understood only steel, sinew, and brute force. To tell them that King Theron of the mountain citadel had eyes that missed nothing, and messengers that could not be touched. In the dark, quiet chamber, Theron watched the chaos unfold. He saw fear, a more potent weapon than any sword. He felt a sense of immense power, a god's power. But as he watched the tiny, terrified figures run and shout in their silent, ghostly world on the stone, he did not feel triumphant. He felt profoundly, utterly alone. The low hum of the scryer was the only sound, a mechanical lullaby for a war that had lost its soul. He leaned his head back against the dark oak, the cold of the stone walls seeping into his bones. The war had just begun, but it was already over. Boren's army was a living, breathing force, full of courage and fury, but they were marching against a ghost. They were fighting a memory from the future. Theron closed his eyes, listening to the filtered, distant sounds of panic from the phantom's senses. He could almost smell the wood smoke, almost feel the biting wind of the wold. Almost, but he was here. In the cold, dark heart of his mountain, with his silent keeper and his all-seeing stone, he was the perfect general of a perfect sterile war, and the silence that followed his thoughts was heavier than any battle cry. The image on the pool continued to show the disorder, the fear, the first cracks in the morale of a great host, all caused by a single silent watcher in the sky. The phantom continued its vigil, a metallic sentry against the gray canvas of the sky. Below, the army of the wold was no longer a confident, invading force. It was a crowd of frightened men, staring at a demon they could not comprehend. In his chamber, King Theron did not move. He kept his eyes closed, listening. Not to the sounds from the scryer, but to the sound of his own slow, measured breathing. A king, a general, a voyeur of a war he could never truly touch. The low, resonant hum of the chamber seemed to deepen, a constant, soothing drone that was the antithesis of the chaos it was displaying. It was the sound of absolute control, the sound of a future bleeding into the past, the sound of a new and terrible kind of power. Long days bled into one another, marked not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the subtle shifts in the shimmering images on the obsidian scryer. The chamber remained a pocket of perpetual twilight, its air still and charged with the low hum of the ancient device. King Theron spent more time in his oaken chair than on his throne. His meals were brought to him on simple wooden trays, and he ate while watching the slow, inexorable decay of Boren's army. It wasn't a decay of numbers. His phantoms had not killed a single soldier. It was a decay of the spirit. He watched as the whispering phantoms executed their silent, coordinated dance. There were 3 of them now, a trinity of silent dread that hung over the wold. They never attacked. They simply appeared. One would hover over the army's foraging parties, its unnerving hum sending men scrambling back to the main camp, empty-handed and pale-faced. Another would appear at midnight, a dark shape against the moon, its single glass eye seeming to stare into the very souls of the sentries, who would be found at dawn, hollow-eyed and muttering of sky demons. The scryer showed it all with cold, impartial clarity. It showed the growing arguments in the camp, the suspicious glances, the way men would flinch at the cry of a hawk or the buzz of a beetle. Alara was a constant, silent presence at his side. She was the only other person who saw what he saw. Her face, usually a mask of calm composure, sometimes held a flicker of something else. Pity? Concern? He could not be sure. She was as much a part of the chamber's mystery as the scryer itself. "The reports from our own patrols are confused," she said one evening, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. She had just returned from the upper citadel. "They say the Wold army is haunted. They speak of ill omens, of a curse upon Boren's banner." Theron's gaze did not leave the pool. He was watching Boren's command tent. The image was stable, the unblinking eye in the heavens focused with unnatural stillness. He could see the agitated shadows of several men moving within the tent, their gestures large and angry. "It is not a curse," Theron said, his voice weary. "It is a message, and Bourne is too proud to understand its language." "He is a man of steel and fury," Alara agreed softly. "He does not know how to fight a shadow." The king leaned forward slightly. "Focus on the command tent. Amplify the sound." Alara moved her hands in the air above the scryer. The low hum of the chamber deepened, and a new sound layered over it. It was faint, distorted by the canvas of the tent in the distance. But the words were discernible, like voices heard through water. "Witchcraft! The whispers of the Mountain King's demons!" a voice roared. It was not Boren's, it was rougher, higher pitched. "There are no demons, you fool!" another voice barked back. This was Bourne, deep, resonant, and frayed with frustration. "It is a trick, a clever deception." "A trick? What kind of trick hangs in the sky and makes no sound but the buzzing of 1,000 trapped hornets? It watches us. I feel its eye on my back even now. My men are deserting. They say the land itself is against us." "Your men are cowards." Theron listened to the argument, a god eavesdropping on the squabbles of mortals. He knew the first voice. It belonged to Garm, one of Bourne's most feared chieftains, a man known for his savagery in battle. To hear fear in his voice was more telling than 100 scout reports. The technology felt less like a tool and more like a transgression, a violation. He was not meeting his enemy on the field of honor. He was peering into their tents, listening to their private fears, dissecting their morale from 100 miles away. He felt the power of it, but also the hollowness. There was no courage in this, no valor, just the cold, relentless application of an advantage so absolute it felt obscene. "Send another phantom," Theron commanded, his voice barely a whisper. "To the east, over their supply line. I don't want it to be seen. I just want to report. Show me their reserves." Alara bowed her head and selected another runestone. A new window opened on the scryer, the cold, geometric vision of another phantom lifting from its hidden nest. It sped eastward, a silent arrow over the sleeping landscape. For a long while, the only sounds were the distant, angry voices from Bourne's tent and the ever-present hum of the chamber. Theron watched the phantom's view as it flew. He saw lonely farmsteads, the thermal signatures of sleeping cattle in a field, the cold ribbon of a road. It was his kingdom, peaceful and unaware of the silent sentinel passing overhead. Then it crossed into the wold. The landscape became wilder, the roads less defined. The phantom's eye scanned the terrain, its internal logic searching for the heat and order of a military convoy. It found it. A long line of wagons, stalled in a muddy ravine. The thermal signatures were weak. Many of the campfires were out. The phantom descended, its sensitive microphone picking up sounds. The cough of a sick man, the low, mournful whinny of a hungry horse, the creak of a wagon wheel settling into the mud. This was Bourne's rear guard, the lifeline of his army, and it was crippled. The rains had been heavy, the roads were a quagmire, and the constant fear of the phantoms had clearly reached even this far back. The men moved with a lethargy that spoke of low morale and empty stomachs. "They are starving," Alara observed. "They are broken," Theron corrected softly. "And they do not even know why." He looked from the image of the suffering supply train to the image of Bourne's tent, where the shouting had now subsided into a sullen silence. He knew where to strike, when to strike, and how. He could send his knights and soldiers out now, not into a battle, but into a massacre. But the thought brought him no satisfaction. He felt a profound sense of weariness settle over him, a weight heavier than his crown. He had been raised on stories of heroes, of glorious charges and epic duels. His father had won this kingdom with a sword in his hand and a war cry in his throat. Theron was winning it with whispers and shadows from a cold, dark room. He thought of the men in that ravine, cold, hungry, and scared. They were his enemies, yes, but they were also just men, and he was tormenting them with a power they could not fight, a power that preyed on the oldest fears of the human heart, the fear of the unknown, the unseen, the unnatural. "Leave the phantom over the ravine," he said at last. "Let it continue to observe, that is all." He rose from his chair, his old bones aching. The constant stillness of the chamber was more tiring than a day's march. "I am going to the battlements," he announced. Alara looked up, surprised. "My king? I need to feel the wind," he said simply. "I need to be reminded that the world is still made of stone and air, not just light and shadow in a pool." He left the chamber, the heavy stone door closing behind him, muffling the low hum. He walked the long, spiraling corridor up towards the surface of his world. With each step, the air grew warmer, the scent of earth replaced by the smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, and living people. He emerged onto the high wall of the citadel, and the shock of the real world was staggering. The wind was a physical thing, cold and sharp against his face, whipping his silver hair and the fur trim of his cloak. The sky was a vast, open bowl of bruised purple and gray, the sun a pale memory behind the clouds. Below, the courtyard was alive with noise and movement. The clang of the smithy, the shouts of men at drill, the smell of hay and horses. It was messy, it was chaotic, it was real. He stood there for a long time, gripping the cold, rough stone of the parapet. He looked out towards the distant, dark line of the wold. His enemy was out there, not as a shimmering image, but as a real army of flesh and blood. And for the first time in days, the war felt real again. And with that reality came the crushing weight of what he was doing. The power he wielded was not just an advantage, it was a perversion of the very nature of conflict. It removed the humanity, the cost, the visceral truth of it. He was a king playing a game with pieces that could feel fear and hunger. A lone hawk circled in the vast sky above, its cries sharp and clear on the wind. It was a natural, beautiful thing. Theron watched it and felt a pang of something he could not name. It was a longing for a simpler time, a simpler war. A war of courage against courage, not of technology against superstition. He had never felt so powerless. He was a prisoner of his own perfect weapon. The wind sighed, a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry the weariness of the world with it. The bruised purple of the sky deepened into the color of a dark plum, and the first hesitant stars began to prick the veil of twilight. Down below, in the citadel, torches were being lit, their flames small, brave sparks of orange against the encroaching dark. The sounds of the day were softening, the sharp clang of steel replaced by the murmur of voices and the crackle of hearth fires. Theron remained at the parapet, a statue carved from granite and grief. He had wanted to feel the world, and he did. He felt its immense, sprawling, indifferent reality. He felt the cold seeping through his leather gloves, the dampness in the air that promised a frost by morning, the distant, comforting scent of baking bread. Each sensation was a small anchor to the world he once knew, the world he had been born to rule and to defend, a world of simple, brutal truths, a world where you looked your enemy in the eye. A heavy, familiar footstep approached from behind. It was a soldier's tread, measured and sure. "My king?" Theron did not turn. He knew the voice. It was Kale, general of his armies, a man whose face was a testament to 100 battles, whose loyalty was as solid as the mountain beneath their feet. "Kale," Theron acknowledged, his own voice sounding thin against the vastness of the evening. Kale came to stand beside him, his gaze also turned towards the darkening expanse of the wold. He was a broad, powerful man, clad in practical boiled leather and chainmail, his presence a comforting bastion of uncomplicated strength. "The men are ready, sire," Kale said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Their spirits are high. Every sword is sharp, every bow is strung. They are eager to march, they ask only for the word." Theron felt a pang of guilt. These good men, his men, were waiting for a command that was shaped by forces they could never imagine. They believed they were waiting for the right moment, for a sign of weakness in the enemy. They did not know that their king was waiting for the enemy's soul to break. "The word will come," Theron said, the answer feeling like ash in his mouth. Kale was silent for a moment, a man not given to questioning his king. But his unease was a palpable thing. "There are strange tales, my king," From the traders and the few folk who have fled the wold, they speak of Borin's army being plagued by ill fortune, of demons in the sky. He gave a short, gruff laugh. The ramblings of terrified peasants, no doubt, but the stories are persistent. Theron looked at the general's profile in the dimming light. The strong jaw, the simple, honest eyes. How could he ever explain the obsidian scryer to this man? How could he say, "Yes, Kale, there are demons in the sky, and I am the one who commands them"? To reveal the secret would be to shatter the world Kale knew, to admit that the virtues he lived by, courage, strength, honor, were now secondary to a humming stone and silent metallic insects. "Fear is a weapon, old friend," Theron said, his words carefully chosen. "And Borin's men have always been a superstitious lot. Let their fears work for us. A little patience is all that is required." Kale nodded, though a flicker of doubt remained in his eyes. "As you command, my king, we wait." He clasped his fist to his heart in salute, the leather of his gauntlet creaking. Then he turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps receding back into the life of the citadel. Theron was alone again, but his solitude felt different now. It was no longer just the isolation of a king, but the isolation of a different species. He was separated from his most loyal men by a gulf of knowledge, a chasm of reality. He was leading them in a war they didn't even know they were fighting. The wind grew colder, its touch more insistent. The last vestiges of light died from the sky, and the stars shone with a fierce, remote brilliance. They looked like the unblinking eyes, cold, distant, and all-seeing. He could not stay here. The real world had offered him no comfort, only a clearer sense of his own alienation. He turned from the parapet, from the wind and the stars and the living sounds of his home, and began the long walk back down into the heart of the mountain, down into the humming silence of his power. The great stone door swung open at his approach, and the familiar coolness of the chamber enveloped him. The low, resonant hum welcomed him like a co-conspirator. It was the sound of his secret, the sound of his victory, the sound of his damnation. Elara stood by the scryer, her form a silhouette against its faint internal light. She did not seem to have moved since he left. "There is a change, my king," she said as he approached. Her voice was calm but held a new note of urgency. Theron came to stand by his chair, his eyes immediately drawn to the shimmering pool. The image was still focused on the main camp of Borin's army, but the scene was different. The chaos of fear had been replaced by a strange, focused activity. Torches had been gathered, hundreds of them. They were arranged in a massive circle in the center of the camp, and in the middle of that circle, a huge bonfire was being built. Men were not running in fear now. They were moving with a grim purpose. "What is this?" Theron breathed. "He is responding," Elara said. "Borin is not a man to let fear fester. He is giving it a form. He is fighting back." The sound from the scryer was clearer now. It was not shouting or argument. It was chanting, a low, guttural, rhythmic chant that rose and fell like a monstrous tide. From a large tent, a new group of figures emerged. They were not soldiers. They were draped in animal skins and bones, their faces painted with grotesque symbols. Shamans, the old magic of the wold, the primal beliefs that had lingered in those dark woods for centuries. One shaman, wearing the skull of a great stag, raised a staff and began an incantation, his voice rising above the chanting of the soldiers. Borin the bull stood beside him, his arms crossed, his massive form lit by the flickering torchlight. He was no longer the confused, angry man in the tent. He was a leader, harnessing the terror that had been inflicted upon him and turning it into a ritual of defiance. "He is performing a rite of cleansing," Elara interpreted softly. "He is naming the phantoms as demons, yes, but he is now convincing his men that he has the power to banish them. He is turning our weapon of fear into a tool for forging unity." Theron watched, mesmerized. The scene was primal, terrifying, and brilliant. The bonfire roared to life, a pillar of fire and smoke ascending into the night sky, a direct challenge to the unseen watchers above. The soldiers roared with it, their fear momentarily burned away by the heat of the flames and the fervor of the ritual. They were no longer just a frightened mob. They were becoming an army of zealots. The phantom hovering high above registered the massive thermal bloom of the fire, its glass eye reflecting the distant, savage light. It continued its silent vigil, but its psychological impact was being challenged. It was being redefined. Theron had used a power beyond their comprehension to make them feel powerless. In response, Boren had invoked a power of his own, the power of belief, of ritual, of shared fanaticism. He was fighting the future with the oldest weapons of the past. The king sank into his oaken chair, the cold wood offering no comfort. The sterile certainty of his war was gone. The equation had been complicated by the one variable his perfect system could not account for: the unpredictable, irrational, and unbreakable spirit of a people who, when faced with a demon, would simply decide to fight back. The humming of the chamber suddenly felt less like a sound of control and more like the purring of a beast he had unleashed, but no longer fully understood. The war was not over. It had just begun to mutate. The great bonfire on the scryer's surface burned with a ferocious, silent intensity. It was the new heart of Boren's army, a pulsating sun of defiance around which his men orbited like planets. The unified chant, filtered through the phantom's distant senses, was a physical presence in the stone chamber, a low, hypnotic thrum that seemed to vibrate in sympathy with the hum of the ancient device. Theron watched, his chin resting on his steepled fingers. The initial shock had passed, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. It was the feeling he got during a game of regicide, the king's game of strategy, when an opponent made a move that was both unexpected and profoundly elegant. A move that changed the entire nature of the board. He was not merely an observer anymore. He was a player in a game he had invented, against an opponent who was learning the rules with terrifying speed. "He is clever," Theron said, his voice a low murmur that did not break the spell of the room. "He has taken our weapon, this intangible fear, and given it a name and a face, and now he is teaching his men how to fight it." "Men can be rallied to fight a demon," Alara responded, her gaze fixed on the image of the head shaman, the man with the stag's skull. "It is harder to rally them against a silent, unknowable dread. He has given them a banner to fight under." The chanting on the scryer grew louder, more fevered. The shamans began to dance, their movements wild and spasmodic, their shadows leaping like giants in the firelight. The soldiers around them were caught in the fervor, their voices rising in a single deafening roar of shared conviction. They were forging themselves into a new kind of army, an army shielded by the armor of fanaticism. Theron watched this process of spiritual alchemy with a detached fascination. His phantoms had been a scalpel, intended to bleed the enemy's morale slowly, quietly. Boren had responded by turning the wound into a sacred mark, a source of shared strength. Psychological warfare had met its match: collective faith. "Patience is no longer enough," Theron stated. He straightened in his chair, a new resolve hardening his features. "We were a storm on the horizon. Now we must become the lightning, not to burn the forest down, but to strike a single tree." Ilara turned her head slightly, her dark eyes questioning him in the gloom. "My king?" "Broad terror has failed. We must be precise. The fear has united them because it is shared. We must make it personal again. We must break their new faith at its source." His gaze narrowed on the figures at the center of the ritual. Boren and his holy men. He leaned closer to the humming pool of black stone. "Elara, I need all phantoms airborne, but their tasks will be different." A flicker of understanding crossed Elara's face. She moved to the pedestal, her hands hovering over the collection of runestones, ready to become the conduit for his will. "The first phantom," Theron began, his voice taking on the clipped cadence of a general issuing field commands, "will move to the western picket line. It will not show itself. It will simply sing. A low, discordant note, enough to spook the horses, to make the sentries feel a chill, a distraction." Ilara selected a stone, its surface cool and smooth. "The second will do the same on the eastern flank, near the foraging tents. A different sound, a whisper. Draw their attention away from the center. Pull their new unity apart at the seams." She picked up a second rune. "The third," he said, his eyes locked on the bonfire, "is for the shamans." He paused, the weight of the command settling in the quiet room. He was about to reach into the very heart of his enemy's ritual, to touch their minds from across the silent miles. It felt like a deeper violation than any that had come before. They believe they are speaking with their gods, Theron mused softly. It would be a pity to interrupt. Perhaps we should help them listen more closely. Elara waited, her expression unreadable. Is it possible, the king asked, to project a sound that only those near the fire will hear? Not a roar, but a murmur, not a threat, but a question. The phantoms can focus their resonance, Elara confirmed. It is possible. What would you have them hear? A thin, cold smile touched Theron's lips, the sound of doubt. He watched as Elara placed the runes upon the scryer's edge. In the two small, secondary windows on the pool's surface, he saw the world from the perspective of the two diversionary phantoms as they moved into position. On the main image, the ritual continued, a vortex of fire and faith, but then a subtle change. A commotion was visible at the edge of the camp. Men were pointing, shouting. The steady rhythm of the chant faltered as heads turned towards the disturbance on the western flank. A horse screamed, a sound of pure terror that briefly pierced the chanting. Then more shouts from the east. Boren's head snapped in that direction, his face a mask of fury at the interruption. The perfect circle of his faithful was becoming ragged, their attention divided, their unity fraying. The distraction was working, the stage was set. The third phantom, a creature of absolute darkness against the star-dusted sky, drifted into position high above the central fire. It was invisible, its faint hum lost in the roar of the flames and the chanting. Its glass eye focused, it waited. Now, Theron whispered. In the humming chamber, nothing changed, but on the surface of the scryer, Theron, the sole witness, saw the effect. He saw the head shaman, the man in the stag skull, suddenly falter in his incantation. The shaman tilted his head as if listening to a voice only he could hear. A look of confusion crossed his painted face. Another shaman, the one shaking a rattle of bones, stopped. He looked at the man beside him, a new suspicion in his eyes. The perfect harmony of their ritual was broken by a note of silent discord that only they could perceive. The phantom was not making a loud noise. It was projecting a complex wave of sound, a vibration that mimicked the half-heard whispers of a crowd, the subtle frequency of anxiety. It was the sound of a secret being told, the sound of a lie being discovered. It was engineered doubt. Boren the bull felt it instantly. Not the sound. He saw the hesitation as holy men. He saw the confusion replacing the fervor. The powerful spiritual weapon he had just forged was beginning to crack in his hands, and he had no idea why. He roared in order, trying to force the ritual to continue, but his voice was now competing with the phantom whispers in his shaman's ears. Theron leaned back in his oaken chair. The ghostly light of the scryer played across his face, illuminating the profound weariness in his eyes. He had countered the move. He had protected his advantage. But this was no longer war. It was something else entirely. It was a form of intimate, remote puppetry. He was pulling the strings of his enemy's very soul, making their faith dance to a tune of his creation. He had won the engagement, but the humming in the room felt colder now, more sinister. It was the sound of a line being crossed, a line from which he knew with chilling certainty he could never return. The war for the wold was becoming a war for his own humanity, and he was not sure who was winning. The manufactured whispers continued to flow from the unseen phantom, a silent venom seeping into the heart of the enemy's newfound faith. On the obsidian scryer, the grand ritual of defiance had curdled into a scene of accusation and chaos. The head shaman tore the stag skull from his head and threw it to the ground, gesturing wildly at his fellow mystics, his silent shouts clearly visible in the tension of his body. Boren the bull, a titan of a man accustomed to his orders being met with swift obedience, now stood amidst a crumbling core of his command. He grabbed one of the shamans by the furs of his cloak, his face a mask of raw fury. But the shaman did not cringe in fear. He pointed a trembling, accusing finger back at Boren, as if the whispers only he could hear were implicating the warlord himself. The poison was working more effectively than Theron could have imagined. He had intended to break their unity. Instead, he had made them turn on one another. The soldiers on the periphery, drawn back by the subsiding distractions on the flanks, now watched the meltdown of their leaders with wide, fearful eyes. Their pillar of strength was collapsing from within. Theron raised a single, placid finger. Enough. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through the humming of the chamber. Elara, ever watchful, gave a slight, assenting nod. She made a subtle gesture, her fingers closing into a soft fist. High above the wold, the phantoms received their new commands. The discordant hums, the insidious whispers ceased. The silent pressure on the minds of Boren's men lifted. The three metallic dragonflies, their work done, banked in the darkness and began their swift, silent journey back towards the hidden nests of the citadel. Silence, in its own way, can be as deafening as a roar. In the sudden absence of the unnerving sounds, the Wold camp was left with only the crackling of its great, useless bonfire and the bitter residue of suspicion. The spell was broken, the fervor was gone. What remained was a profound and unsettling quiet, filled with the poison of doubt. Theron watched the aftermath. There was no victory cheer in the chamber, no sense of triumph. He felt only a vast, hollow emptiness. He had not defeated an army. He had merely conducted a symphony of paranoia from a dark, sterile room. He felt unclean, as if the psychic grime of his actions had somehow settled upon his own soul. He could feel a phantom ache in his bones, a weariness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the nature of his victory. On the scryer, the scene continued to devolve. The shamans were escorted away, not as holy men, but as prisoners. Boren stood alone by the fire for a long moment, his back to the image-gathering eye in the sky. His shoulders, which always seemed broad enough to carry the weight of the world, were slumped. Then he straightened. He turned, and even in the ghostly thermal image, Theron could see a terrifying new resolve etch itself onto his features. It was not the confident resolve of a leader. It was the brittle, terrible resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. Boren began to shout, not at any one person, but at the camp at large. His voice, unheard but for its effect, rippled through the soldiers. He strode through the camp, kicking at slumbering men, gesturing with his great axe not towards the heavens, but towards the dark silhouette of the mountains on the horizon. Towards the citadel, towards Theron. "What is he doing?" Elara whispered, a note of true alarm in her voice for the first time. "He is a cornered animal," Theron replied, his voice grim. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, analyzing the new patterns of movement. The spirit is broken, the mind is confused, so he is abandoning both. He is falling back on the only thing he has left. "His rage," asked Elara. "His momentum," the king corrected. "He is ordering a forced march. Now, tonight. He knows his army will disintegrate if it stays still, if the men are allowed to think, to let the poison of our work settle. He intends to outrun his own despair." The scryer confirmed his analysis. The entire camp was in motion. Tents were being haphazardly struck, wagons loaded with a frantic, careless energy. There was no order, no discipline. It was the movement of a flood, a chaotic, desperate surge of humanity. They were coming, all of them, and they were coming now. The sterile intellectual game was over. The pieces on the board had scattered and were now stampeding towards him. Theron's strategy of slow, meticulous erosion had worked too well, and in doing so had triggered the one thing he had sought to avoid: a direct, physical, and bloody confrontation. He looked at the image of the surging, chaotic army, a river of desperate men about to break upon his shores. For the first time, they did not look like ghostly figures in a pool. They looked like a real and imminent threat. And he thought of Kale. He thought of his general, likely asleep in his quarters, dreaming of honorable battle. He thought of his soldiers, sharp and eager, waiting for a glorious charge. The war Theron had promised them, the war he had denied them, was now unavoidable. He would have to send them out there. He would have to send them into that cauldron of desperation and fury. There would be no more clean, silent victories viewed from the comfort of this chamber. The next stage of the war would be fought with steel, not with shadows. It would be loud, it would be visceral, it would be measured in screams and blood and the terrified last breaths of men, his men, Boren's men. The low hum of the scryer seemed to mock him, a steady, indifferent pulse beneath the coming storm. He had wielded the power of a god, and his punishment was to now face the most terrifyingly human of consequences. He had to give the order. He had to wake Kale. He had to send his knights and soldiers into the ugly, brutal, and honest reality of war. The power he held in this room had allowed him to control the enemy's minds, but it could not protect his own men from their swords. The abstract game had ended. The bill for his remote, perfect war had just come due, and it would be paid in flesh and blood on the fields below his home. He slowly rose from his chair, the ghostly light of the scryer illuminating a face that had suddenly aged another decade. The walk to the battlements to feel the wind had been a brief respite. The walk he had to take now to the general's quarters felt like a walk to the gallows. The great stone door sealed the humming chamber behind him, and the silence that greeted Theron was of a different kind. It was not the charged electric silence of the scryer, but the deep, dormant silence of a mountain asleep. He walked the spiraling corridors upwards, his soft leather boots making no sound on the worn stone. With each step, the world changed. The air lost its sharp, ozone tang, growing thick with the familiar sense of cold stone, dust, and the faint, smoky residue of 1,000 torches. The profound stillness was gradually replaced by the subtle sounds of life. The distant sigh of a sleeping guard, the scuttling of a mouse in the walls, the low groan of the citadel's ancient foundations. He was ascending from a tomb of knowledge back into the world of the living. Kale's quarters were near the main armory, a Spartan room furnished with little more than a bed, a weapons rack, and a heavy wooden chest. Theron did not knock. He pushed the simple plank door open and entered. The general was asleep, but it was the sleep of a wolf, light and ready. At the quiet click of the latch, Kale was awake, sitting up, his hand instinctively reaching for the greatsword that leaned against his bed. His eyes, clear and sharp even in the gloom, focused on the king. There was no confusion, only readiness. "My king?" Kale's voice was a low rumble. "They are coming," Theron said simply. There was no time for explanation, no way to articulate the truth. He had to rely on the currency of his crown, absolute trust, Boren's entire host. A forced march. They will be at the outer walls before dawn. Kale did not question him. He did not ask how Theron could possibly know this. He saw the grim certainty in his king's eyes and accepted it as fact. He swung his legs out of bed, a man of muscle and sinew moving with an economy born of countless battles. "I will sound the alarm." "Do it," Theron commanded, full defensive posture. "I want archers on every wall and the cavalry ready in the main courtyard." Kale was already pulling on his boiled leather tunic, his movements swift and efficient. "They will find the mountain has teeth, sire." He paused for a fraction of a second, looking at his king. "You look weary." "The watch has been long," Theron replied, the words feeling truer than Kale could ever know. The general nodded, accepting the answer. He grabbed his sword and strode from the room, leaving Theron alone in the sudden emptiness. A moment later, a single, deep, resonant bong echoed through the citadel, the first toll of the great war bell. Another followed, then another, faster and faster, a frantic, brazen clangor that shattered the night's peace. It was a sound of pure, physical urgency. It was the sound of the real war beginning. From the arrow-slit window in Kale's room, Theron watched the fortress erupt into controlled chaos. Torches flared to life in the darkness like angry fireflies. Shouted orders cut through the din of the bells. The dark, sleeping courtyards filled with the clatter of steel and the hurried footsteps of thousands of men moving to their posts. The citadel was waking up, its iron heart beginning to beat to the drum of war. But Theron did not go to the battlements. He did not join Kale in the exhilarating rush of preparation. The loud, vibrant, human world of the defense was not his station, not anymore. He felt the inexorable pull of the chamber. He turned his back on the awakening fortress and descended once more into the quiet depths of the mountain. He left the noise, the fire, the fear, and the courage, and returned to the cold, humming heart of his power. When he re-entered the chamber, Elara was waiting. The image on the scryer had changed. It no longer showed a camp, but a horrifying moving carpet of thermal signatures, a river of heat and motion pouring through the dark woods, aimed directly at the citadel. Boren's horde. The deep tolling of the war bells from the world above could be felt even here, a faint low vibration that traveled through the rock, a ghostly echo in the humming silence. "They are fast," Elara stated, her voice calm as ever. They are desperate, Theron corrected. He moved to his chair but did not sit. He stood beside it, a commander on his new bridge. Our forces? Alara's fingers danced in the air. The image on the scryer split. One half showed the enemy's chaotic advance. The other half showed the orderly, geometric deployment of his own soldiers moving in to their defensive positions along the citadel's outer walls. Two armies, viewed from the heavens, one a raging flood, the other a granite dam. This was the new purpose of his ancient inheritance. Not a weapon of the mind, but a tool of tactical omniscience. The first clash, when it came, was a silent, beautiful, terrible thing on the surface of the pool. The wave of hot, bright signatures of Boren's army slammed into the cooler, ordered lines of the Citadel Guard. It was a collision of light, a splash of chaos against a wall of order. But through the stone floor, Theron could feel the faint, horrifying roar of the real collision from the world above. He could hear the distant screams. He saw a clean war, but he heard the filthy truth of it. Boren's men are exhausted, but their numbers are greater on the western approach, Theron observed, his eyes scanning the swirling patterns of light. Kale's flank will be overwhelmed there if it holds too long. He needed to get this information to his general. Alara, he commanded, his voice sharp with a new authority, send for a runner, the fastest you have. He is to stand at the door. He does not enter. He does not look. He only listens for your voice. Alara bowed and disappeared into the corridor, returning moments later. Theron could not see the runner, but he knew he was there, waiting in the darkness. The battle raged on the scryer. Theron saw a weakness, a part of Boren's horde peeling away, unnoticed by the main fighting, circling towards a secondary, weaker gatehouse. From the ground, they would be invisible until it was too late. From the heavens, their intent was as clear as day. The old eastern gate, Theron said, his voice ringing with urgency in the quiet chamber. They are sending a force to the eastern gate. Alara turned her head towards the door, and her clear, calm voice relayed the message into the corridor. Reinforce the eastern gate. A flanking party approaches. Theron heard the runner's footsteps sprinting away, the sound quickly fading. He turned back to the scryer, his heart pounding. He was no longer a king, a philosopher, or a puppeteer. He was the nerve center of a living, fighting body. He was the eye of the storm. He watched the silent, swirling patterns of life and death on the black stone, the weight of 1,000 lives resting on his every observation. The abstract game had become terrifyingly real, and he, in his silent room, was the most active combatant of all. The runner's footsteps faded into the stone, an artery carrying the will of the mountain's heart. In the chamber, time seemed to stretch and slow. Theron's world was now the 10-foot circle of polished night, a god's eye view of a war fought in silence. He watched the small, determined stream of Boren's flanking party approach the eastern gate. They were moving swiftly, confidently, believing their path was clear. Then, on the scryer, another stream of light emerged from the gatehouse to meet them. Kale's reserves? The interception was perfect. The two glowing streams collided, not with the chaotic splash of the main battle, but in a contained, violent swirl. The surprise attack had been neutralized before it had ever truly begun. A quiet sigh of air, barely audible, escaped Alara's lips. It was the only acknowledgement of the averted disaster. Theron felt no relief. He felt only the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a successful calculation. He had moved a piece on the board, and it had taken one of his opponents. That was all. The faint, distant roar of the battle, filtering through the rock, was the only reminder of the cost of that move. A new rhythm established itself in the chamber. It was a cycle of observation, command, and consequence, played out in a loop of profound and terrible efficiency. Observe. Theron's eyes would scan the swirling chaos on the scryer, his mind detached from the individual lives represented by the lights, seeing only patterns, vectors, and points of pressure. He saw a section of his northern wall where the defenders' lights were flickering, thinning, about to be overwhelmed by a surge from Boren's horde. Command. The northern wall, Section 4, he'd state, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The line is buckling. Relay. Alara, his quiet priestess, would turn and speak the words to the waiting runner at the door. Northern wall, Section 4. The line is buckling. Send the Crimson Guard. Wait. The agonizing seconds as the runner disappeared, and they watched the scryer, waiting for the telltale lights of the Crimson Guard to move from the central courtyard towards the failing line. It was a strange and terrible trinity of command. The omniscient king, the calm priestess, and the breathless, unknowing messenger, all bound together in a chain that linked this silent, sterile room to the bloody chaos above. The pressure on the northern wall was immense. The reserves would not get there in time. The line of lights was visibly bending, about to snap. Theron's gaze hardened. It was time for a more direct intervention. "Prepare a phantom," he commanded. "Target the horde pressing the northern wall. I do not want an attack. I want a sign, a blinding one." Alara's hands moved, selecting a new rune. A phantom held in reserve lifted from its hidden spire. Its flight was a silent, swift arc through the battle smoke-choked sky. It positioned itself high above the failing section of the wall, an unseen predator in the night. "Execute," Theron breathed. On the ground for the savage warriors of the wold, the world ended in a flash of impossible silent light. One moment they were surging forward, the screams of victory in their throats, their axes raised to strike down the last of the shield wall. The next, the sky itself tore open in a pulse of pure white brilliance. It was not hot like fire or loud like thunder. It was a profound and absolute whiteness that erased the world, overwhelming their senses. It was as if the sun had fallen from the sky and shattered on the rocks. They stumbled back, blinded, disoriented, screaming in terror. They dropped their weapons, clawing at eyes that saw only searing after-images. The charge dissolved into a panicked, sightless mob. On the scryer, Theron saw the effect as a brilliant, localized flash, after which the dense cluster of attacking lights recoiled and scattered like embers from a fire. The defenders' line, given a priceless reprieve, held fast. The king felt a cold shiver trace its way down his spine. The power was intoxicating. It was precise. It was absolute. With a gesture, from the safety of his mountain's heart, he could wield the sun itself as a weapon. But in the heart of the battle, Borin the bull saw it too. He was not blinded by the flash, but he saw its effect. He saw his best warriors fall back, screaming about the heavens splitting apart. He had felt the ground shudder when his flanking party was met with impossible speed. He could not see the strings, but he could see the puppet show. And his rage finally coalesced into a single burning point of clarity. He could not fight this phantom army. He could not defeat a sorcerer king who commanded the stars and the sun. But he could kill a man. On the scryer, Theron watched a new and terrifying movement. A dense, brilliant cluster of lights detached itself from the main battle. It was Borin, surrounded by his personal guard, his Huskarls, the most loyal and deadly warriors in his host. They were no longer attacking the walls. They ignored the battle raging around them. They formed a spearhead, a wedge of pure ferocity, and aimed it directly at the citadel's main gate. They moved with a singular, terrifying purpose. They were a battering ram of flesh and steel, intended to smash their way through to the heart of the mountain, to the throne room, to the king. "He's coming for me," Theron whispered. The detached calm of the strategist was gone, replaced by a sudden, cold understanding. The war was no longer about territory or victory. It had become a personal duel between two kings. One fought with swords and fury, the other with light and shadows. Borin was done fighting the ghosts. He was hunting the man who controlled them. The runner at the door awaited a command. The phantoms in the sky awaited a target. His army on the walls awaited his orders. But all Theron could do was watch the relentless, shining spearhead of his enemy driving through the chaos, a point of singular hatred aimed directly at him. The humming of the chamber suddenly felt fragile. It was the only thing separating him from the raw, physical fury of the man on the screen. The war was no longer miles away. It was climbing his mountain. It was beating at his gate. The spearhead of light drove relentlessly through the chaos on the scryer's surface. It was a single, coherent thought in a mind gone mad with battle. Borin's thought, and it was aimed directly at the heart of the mountain, at Theron. For the first time, a primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced the king's detached composure. This was no longer a game of strategy. The board had been overturned, and one of the pieces, a wild, furious king, was coming to kill the player. The humming of the chamber, once a sound of absolute power, now felt like a fragile shell against the raw, physical hatred that was charging his gate. His hand tightened on the arm of his oaken chair. He had one final weapon, one last resort he had never used, a line he had never crossed. The phantoms were not just messengers and tormentors, they were killers. They could deliver a payload not of light or sound, but of death, a shower of tiny, razor-sharp flechettes, an iron rain. He could end it. Now, he could dispatch a phantom and with a single whispered word to Alara, obliterate Boren and his honor guard from the face of the earth. He could turn that spearhead of light into a fading, dying glimmer. It would be clean, it would be efficient, it would be safe. It would be the final damnation of his soul. My king! Alara's voice was a soft, steady anchor in the storm of his thoughts. She was watching him, not the scryer. She knew the choice he was facing. His lips parted. The command was there, on the tip of his tongue, the word that would unleash murder from a clear sky. But then on the surface of the pool, something changed. A new movement. From the Citadel's defenders, a block of brilliant, disciplined light detached itself from the main defensive line. It moved with a speed and purpose that mirrored Boren's own. The Crimson Guard, Kale's personal retinue. And at its head, a single, brilliant light, Kale himself was racing to intercept. The old general had seen the threat. He had not needed a runner or a whispered command. He had read the battle with his own eyes, the old way, and he was moving to confront the greatest danger. He was placing himself, his body, his honor, and his steel between his king and the invading warlord. A champion's duel, a clash of titans, the oldest story. Theron stared at the two converging points of light. The future and the past were on a collision course. His future, safe, sterile, remote-controlled death, and Kale's past, brutal, honorable, face-to-face combat. He had the power to save his friend. To eliminate the threat with no risk to his own men. All it would take was a word, but what would be the cost? He would win the battle, but he would prove that the virtues Kale was about to risk his life for, courage, sacrifice, honor, were meaningless. He would render his best man's final, greatest act obsolete. Theron, slowly, deliberately, removed his hand from the arm of the chair. He let the breath he was holding escape his lungs in a long, shuddering sigh. "Do nothing," he whispered. His voice was hoarse. "Keep a phantom overhead. I want to see it, but do nothing." Alara looked at him, and in the faint ghostly light of the scryer, he saw a flicker of profound relief in her eyes. She bowed her head, not just as a servant to her king, but as a witness to a choice. Theron had abdicated his godhood. He chose to be a man, a king who trusted his champion. He chose the risk of the old world over the certainty of the new one. He chose to have faith in flesh and blood over metal and glass. He was powerless now by his own design, a mere spectator to the most important fight of the war. The scryer became his entire world. The image zoomed, focusing on the imminent collision. The two spearheads met. The silent impact on the pool was dazzling. A flash of light as the Huskarls and the Crimson Guard crashed into one another. The battle around them seemed to fade into insignificance. This was the heart of the war now. In the center of that violent, swirling nebula of light, two brighter points met and locked, Boren and Kale. They were a blur of motion, orbiting each other in a deadly dance that was too fast, too chaotic for the scryer to render in clear detail. Theron gripped the back of his chair, his knuckles white. He could see nothing but the abstract patterns of light, but his mind filled in the blanks. He could almost hear the shriek of steel on steel, the roars of rage, the grunts of effort. He could feel the ground tremble with the force of their blows, a tremor that traveled up through the mountain's roots into the soles of his feet. The irony was a physical weight upon him. He had built a system to remove the uncertainty and chaos of war, and now he was using it only to be a helpless witness to the most uncertain and chaotic spectacle of all, a duel between two heroes. He watched, he waited. The hum of the chamber was a monotonous prayer. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the swirling dance of the two lights, locked in a struggle for the soul of the kingdom. Then, the movement changed. The frantic orbit stopped. The two lights, Kale and Boren, merged into a single, unmoving, brilliant point of light on the dark stone. One of them had fallen, but from this height, from his god's eye view, it was impossible to tell which one. A breath caught in Theron's throat. The world, both the real one of humming stone and the ethereal one of silent light, seemed to hold itself in a moment of absolute stillness. The single merged point of light on the scryer was a new star, a nova of violence whose outcome was unknown. He felt Alara's presence beside him, as still and silent as the standing stones of old. She too was watching, waiting. The distant, muted roar of the battle outside was the only sound, a constant, grinding reminder of the stakes. Then, as slowly as it had merged, the lights separated. Two distinct points once more. One flared with a final, defiant brilliance, then flickered and was extinguished, fading back into the chaotic, shimmering background of the lesser battle. It was gone. The other light remained. It was stationary for a long moment, as if gathering its strength. Then it began to move. Not forward, not with a renewed charge, but slowly, painfully, it began a retreat back towards the main gate, back towards the citadel. It was Kale. He was alive. A wave of relief so profound it left Theron dizzy washed over him. He gripped the back of his chair to steady himself. He had not realized how tightly every muscle in his body had been coiled. Kale was alive. The old way had prevailed. On the scryer, the effect of Born's fall was instantaneous and catastrophic for his army. The spearhead, the focus point of their rage, dissolved without its tip. The Huskarls, seeing their lord fall, broke. The news, a cry of despair passing from man to man, spread like wildfire through the walled ranks. The invading army, already battered, exhausted, and psychologically broken, shattered completely. The organized lines of battle disappeared. The raging flood became a frantic, terrified mob, each man fighting only for his own escape. The battle was over. The rout had begun. Theron watched as his own forces, sensing the shift, pushed forward, turning the retreat into a slaughter. He saw it all with perfect, cold clarity on the dark pool. He saw the pockets of resistance being snuffed out, the fleeing lights being overtaken. He felt nothing, no joy, no triumph. Only the immense, soul-crushing weight of it all. He had won. His kingdom was safe. But the victory felt as hollow as the chamber around him. His gaze returned to the single point of light that was his general. Kale was moving slowly, a wounded lion heading for his lair. The victory had not been won by the humming stone or the silent phantoms. It had not been won by a clever king in a dark room. It had been won by the courage of one good man, willing to trade his life for his king's. It had been won with sweat and blood, and a price Theron, in his sterile chamber, could never have paid. He looked at the obsidian scryer, this inheritance of terrible, seductive power. He had used it to terrorize, to manipulate, to command, and in the end, a power too clean, too simple for the messy, complicated world of men. A power that promised control, but only delivered isolation. He was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. He was tired of the humming, tired of the ghostly lights, tired of being a god. He turned his back on the pool of black light, on the images of his grim victory. He looked at Alara, whose face was illuminated by the faint shimmering glow. "Let it sleep," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "All of it, the eyes, the phantoms, let them sleep." He did not wait for her reply. He walked towards the great stone door, towards the corridor that led up into the world of noise and consequence. He wanted to feel the cold night wind on his face. He wanted to stand on the battlements, not as an observer, but as a king. He needed to go to the infirmary, to the side of the man who had truly won his war. As he walked away, the low, resonant hum of the chamber began to fade behind him. The thousands of tiny lights on the scryer, the images of the distant battle, the last vestiges of the fleeing army, they all began to swirl, to lose their focus, to dissolve back into the placid, starless night of the polished stone. The eye that saw everything was closing. The great, terrible machine was returning to its slumber. And today's story also slowly comes to a close.